What's going on, everybody? So we're going to be talking about inmate reentry and community corrections and what that is about. When you look through the PowerPoint, you're going to see an outline. It'll have the prison culture. It'll have prison violence. So we're going to start kind of with the culture. Then we're going to move over to violence, how they maintain order in the prisons. And then when it deals with male prisoners versus female prisoners, what does that look like? As well as returning to society. So as we go through this PowerPoint, we're going to break it down into these levels. So let's talk a little bit about culture. Now, when you start looking at the PowerPoint under prison culture, you're going to find that all institutions have a culture. Now, I want you to think thoroughly about this one. If you're working in law enforcement, think about the terminology that you have, the different kind of talk that we have, okay? So when they say jargon, right, like cop jargon, okay? So officers might be like, yeah, you know what? So, you know, what time did you come, at 10:41 at? And, they're like, oh, what time did you, call on duty at? What time are you going to take your 7? Or what time are you going to take your 0? So basically, it's like me throwing out, hey, what time are you going to take your break, your 15-minute break? Or when are you going to take your half-hour break? As I use those different languages, we all have different languages and we all have different cultures that we develop in each one of our industries. So that's the same thing with prison culture. Prison culture, like when we talk in the PowerPoint, it talks about banks and schools, and they all have their language, their values and norms. And that's the exact same thing with the prisons. When you get into prison, people have to understand that culture in order to survive. Now, where do you want to be in prison? That's the question. Do you want to make your way up to the ranks in the prison because that's the way you live, right? Like you've been in juvenile detention all your life. Now all of a sudden you get moved over to the big prison system. And at that point, you got to survive. This is your life. Like in Shawshank Redemption, when we talk about being institutionalized, right? There are people that are like that and they're comfortable living in the prisons. So when we start looking at that prison culture and what that's like, we have to understand their values, okay, when you're in there. Like what is part of that survival? So when you start looking at what boundary do you cross, what boundary do you not cross? If I smile at someone and say, hey, how are you doing, and act all friendly, well, in the prison, they're going to be looking at me like, why is that guy acting too friendly to me? Something there. You don't act that friendly. They trying to hurt me? They got something set up against me? What's going on? Okay? So the prisons, based upon that stuff too, you might see a lot of people in the PowerPoint will have different gangs kind of stuff, right? Or different things of what people are doing, in prison. So you might see a clock with no hands, right? And at that point, they're spending a long time behind bars. Like, when am I going to get out? You know what I mean? You might see somebody with a teardrop, right? And at that point they're serving because maybe they did some kind of a homicide somewhere, right? Or killed somebody, and that's why they got that. There's a couple things in the PowerPoint. I'm not going to have to go over all of them, but if you see like 1488 dealing with supremacists, and basically, I mean, you start seeing that kind of stuff in there, that they're probably with white supremacy or something like that, whatever it might be. So you can go and look at the PowerPoint and see there's different stuff. I mean, whenever you go online, you can look at different gang stuff. Some gang stuff has stayed, like, these are like the teardrop, right? Like this stuff is always consistent, but there's also a lot of different gangs, okay? And depending if you're with People or Folk Nation and all the gangs that fall under each one of those, I mean, the street gangs actually are affiliated with different ones with People and Folk Nation. And it gets really, really crazy and when you start seeing where each one of these gangs branch off. Because you may have little minor street gangs that are affiliated with, the People or Folk Nation. So, these street gangs might be tied in with this, maybe the Crips, right? Where, these are tied in with the GDs, right? Gangster Disciples. So as you get in prison, they get bigger, right? So when you start talking about MS-13 and stuff like that, you better look out. These dudes are really violent. And in the prison culture, if you don't understand like different tattoos, you don't understand different talk, you can talk to the wrong person the wrong way and find yourself getting shanked or something like that. So you really have to understand that prison culture and the language and the body art and the tattoos once you're inside the prison, as well as working in corrections. You have to be very, very diligent in understanding the different gang stuff that you see so that you don't put two rival members in a gang in the same cell. I'll never forget it. It was early on in my career at Kentwood PD, and I arrested this guy, and he jumped out of the car, started threatening me right away at the traffic stop. And anyways, he and I I got him I ended up arresting him because he had several warrants, okay, for his arrest. And that's part of the reason why he jumped out of his car and started yelling at me and wanting to fight me and stuff like that. But got him under arrest. I take him down to the jail, and I didn't realize that on his shirt he was part of Mad Ave, okay, which is a gang. So, like, we go up to the area of the thing, and I'm like, hey, listen, they're like, are you in any gangs? And he's like, yeah. And they're like, yep, you're with Mad Ave, okay. Because part of the thing is they don't want to put a Mad Ave person in with, like, say, Bemis or East Ave at that point in time, right? Because if they put him in with that cell, they might beat him up or kill him, okay? Or vice versa. You don't know how it goes. So dealing with the different gangs, it's very important to understand the different tattoos and signs so that you can protect people and protect the violence from actually happening within the prison walls, and including even jails. So the question is this: adapting to prison society and understanding what that might look like. So they categorized people in, like, if you got a professional criminal that, that's all they do. They go in, or they get out of prison, and what do? They go back to selling drugs or whatever. They go back to doing home invasions, or they go back to doing B&E of buildings. And they just have this thing, it's how they survive. It's the only thing that they know. Okay, so then they get caught and they're doing time. So this is where, like, they're like, okay, cool, I'm gonna follow the rules. So if you're an inmate and you're just doing time, this is John Irwin's patterns of what he said that basically describe inmate behavior. So he says doing time are like those professional criminals that they get caught, they go in prison, and they're like, okay, cool, if I just do what's right, listen to the guards, get through this time here, maybe I can get it shortened, get released on good time, whatever it might be. I just want to do whatever I can to get myself out of here. That right there is doing time. Now, when we talk about jailing, this is when we get into Shawshank Redemption, right? When it talks about I've been institutionalized, I've been in too long, where I can't make my way out in the real world because, I'm not used to that. I'm used to getting called for my lunch. I'm getting used to getting called for my breakfast. So at that point, what happens is this: these people feel very comfortable in the prison life, okay? They made themselves, this is their culture at this point. They feel comfortable with it, they like it, they know they're getting meals, they know they're, housed, they just know how the system goes. So with that was called jailing, okay? Now, there's also those who are gleaning. The gleaning are the ones that are like, okay, I'm not going to be in here that long, and I want to prepare myself for the outside. So they start taking every kind of resource that they possibly can, whether it's any kind of drug therapy or whatever it is, any kind of classes that would get them a GED or whatever it might be, so that they can come out of prison and actually use that prison time to actually assist them bump themselves up into a better spot when they get out of prison. And then there's disorganized criminals, and these are a lot of mental patients or that have a lot of mental impairments, as well as dealing with anybody that are really low intelligence that just don't get it, and it's impossible for them to adapt to any kind of life within that prison system. I mean, it is tough for them. Like, they shouldn't be there. They should be somewhere else that can help them with everything that they're dealing with, mentally and emotionally and through all those things. But as you go into the prison, you're like, that culture is made up of a lot of different people. And there's aging population in prison, and we can kind of look at the reasons why the aging is occurring. It's because, we look at longer prison terms, right? Mandatory prison term sets, okay? And we also look at the recidivism. So recidivism, it means basically like, I go in prison because I screwed up. Maybe I got a drug abuse problem, right? And I'm selling drugs to support my habit. Well, I sell so much cocaine and, it's a felony, and I get caught. I get sent to prison. Well, I keep selling it again. I get caught. I get sent back to prison. Then I get caught again, and I get sent back to prison. That every time I get sent back to prison is recidivism, okay? So you get older people that are still, hooked on that drug or whatnot, or still involved with that. They get sent back to that prison, and you start getting an older population. However, it's still a young population, but you also have you're seeing more older people because of what we just discussed. Now, when we start looking at prisons, there's something I've never thought about before, and that is the sick people that are in prison. When you start looking at the percentages, I think it's somewhere, maybe around 40 or 50%. It's a good percentage of people that have some kind of either cancer, high blood pressure, diabetes, that are in prison right now, and we need to take care of their health. So when you start dealing with the prisons, you're not just lodging somebody in there, but you're also doing their health care as well. And you have to make sure, which we're going to get to later, okay, about how we got to take care of our inmates, okay, because it's constitutional. It falls on their Eighth Amendment. If you don't take care of their health, I mean, that's cruel and unusual punishment, right? I mean, you got somebody in there and you know that they have cancer and you're not helping them out with that. That's a problem, right? So anyways, when we start looking at the population who are sick, and basically the cause of 9 to 10 deaths in state facilities have to deal with the health issues, okay? Mortality rates of inmates 55 and older, I mean, they're a higher group, right? I mean, they're more at risk. And now we take COVID and we throw that into the mix, you're going to see a lot more deaths through the prison systems, probably just because people are already ill enough and they're sitting in prison. And if they got COVID or COVID starts spreading through that prison at that point, maybe you could see more deaths at a higher level than what you normally would. So we got to think about how do we take care of our prisoners while they're in dealing with their health. With that mental health issue, the prisons are like, you know what, if somebody's mentally ill, do they really need to be in here? Is this like a housing area just for people who are mentally ill? Because mentally ill people tend also to commit crimes because they're mentally ill. And they're trying to survive in their own mind, and they're doing stuff that goes against society, right? And the social norms and values and norms. And you start seeing, 60% of the health issues deal with mental illness and dealing with depression, anxiety, psychotic episodes. And the prisons and jails are like, we're not a dumping ground for this, okay? We should not be a dumping ground for this. This should be something that deals with mental health, and we need to be more prepared if we're going to get these people in here. How are we going to deal with people who are dealing with all these mental health issues? We need more people on our staff to work with these people in dealing with certain programs so that we can give them the mental health aid that they need for our prison culture alone, right? I mean, so as far as that goes, those are some of the things that we have to look at dealing with our prisons and dealing with health, is the mental health side of things too. I mean, we can always talk about cancer and diabetes, but mental health, that's a big deal. That's a tough one to try to handle. I mean, that's a bear, especially when you're talking like that's a 60% of some of the health issues that you deal with. As far as violence in the prisons, we always think, oh gosh, I don't want to go to prison because there's a lot of stuff. I don't want to get raped. I don't want to have, get shanked or whatever it might be. But why? Why is there so much violence in prisons? And we have to understand, when we start looking at the hierarchy of the prison system, and if you want to be successful in business, you understand that you got to take certain steps. You got to go to college. After you get to college, you got to make sure you interview well. After you interview well, you got to make sure that you're doing the job effectively. You got to make sure you got the right connections and network well. And once you start networking well, got the right connections, do a good job, you start finding yourself moving up that hierarchy in the corporate world, right? Well, it's the same thing with prisons, okay? Violence. So one, you're going to be violent because you don't want to be taken advantage of. So if you're violent, people are going to be like, ooh, dude, you don't mess with him. He's crazy, right? So if he's crazy, I don't want to screw around with him. That guy gets violent. And so one, it's for protection, right? It's like, and it's giving you a self-image, like, don't mess with me, I'll hurt you, okay? Two, I mean, you're looking at, how do I get higher up if I'm in a gang, right? So I'm in a gang in prison. I want to make my way up, so I'm going to start networking. I'm going to show them I'm a bad dude. Because the badder I am, the more people are going to fear me, the higher up in that hierarchy I might go in that gang within the prison. As far as acquiring certain goods, or like, you can start threatening people, give me this or you're going to get shanked. Okay, and they're like, oh gosh, here's some cigarettes or whatever it might be, right? So that they don't get shanked, so they know you're serious. As far as it goes with rapes, that deals more with the sexual relief side of stuff like that, and that gets really twisted in a lot of different ways, especially more with men than women. Women, it's more like unwanted touching. Men, it's totally different. It can be bad. So based upon those things, that's why PREA was enacted with the rapes. So when PREA got enacted, and basically what it does is it sets certain regulations so that rapes don't happen in prisons, okay? So there's certain rules and policies and guidelines that have been established to prevent rapes within the prisons, and that's what that PREA actually stands for with the prisons. Dealing with why else would I be violent in prison would be part of the study was this deprivation model. Like, okay, I don't have my freedom. I don't have my coffee like I have in the morning. I don't have my regular, cool tennis shoes. I just don't have what I'm used to. And I start getting frustrated and things just aren't normal. And I want to unleash somewhere. And that's where that model comes from. So that violence comes from that. Where when we start discussing that relative deprivation, we start looking at more of the fact of, it's like you're taking away my freedoms from a normal, like you're just taking away my freedoms as a normal inmate. So it's like as soon as I start getting this aggression caused because you're eliminating my services as an inmate. So let's say maybe you take away my visits with family or whatever it might be. At that point, I might be, okay, I'm getting pissed. So, I might get more aggressive with that. And we're going to talk about STGs with the security threat groups here in a little bit. And, when you start taking away my specific freedoms as an inmate, I mean, that might light me up a little bit, right? That might piss me off. So I might become violent. As far as riots in the prisons, I mean, they're not, everybody's like, oh, there's riots over here. We have had riots in the prisons. We've had riots in Michigan prison. But with as far as it goes with riots, it's not as common as what you think. They're rare when they actually happen, and most of them happen because of the fact that the prisoners living in there, it's not good conditions. The people, the officers who are watching over the people in there are jerks. They're not giving the inmates what they really need. It's just dirty conditions. It's nasty, and it's just not humane. And when it starts getting like that, you're going to get people pissed off. And when you start getting people pissed off, at that point, they're going to eventually come together as one, and they're going to light it up, right? They're going to have enough. So you have to be careful when you're running those prisons that you make sure that it's a clean, that your officers are trained well, that people are respectful but safe at the same end, right? And the rules are the rules to that prison. And when I say the rules are the rules to that prison, they're maintained well. Okay, I mean, you don't have officers in the corrections prisons just beating people up, right, with MDOC. Okay, those correctional officers are doing stuff that are right, but you're letting know, shoot, I'm going to get a ticket. The inmate's going to be like, I'm going to get a ticket, and I'm going to lose these privileges if I do this. I don't want to do that. So the guards maintain that order, and, they keep on the small stuff so big stuff doesn't happen. And, it can work out well. But if they're not doing that, obviously, riots could actually happen. As far as segregation within the prisons, so they lost with the Supreme Court with segregating people within prisons. However, the courts did give them a way out, and they said if there's emergencies that they need to segregate specific people from each other in the prisons, that's okay. So there is a way out, because you got to understand, we got to think about that big picture here. If we start realizing, oh crap, this gang's pissed off at this gang right now and they're about to go at it, do we need to move them away? So let's say a white supremacist group is really pissed off right now at MS-13, and we know that they're going to get a hit. Do we got to separate those parties from each other to protect, the prison? Well, absolutely. That's a big deal, right? So, I mean, as far as it goes with the race and segregation and stuff like that, the Supreme Court said it's not, you can't segregate them. However, they gave them a way out. If it's going to get dangerous because there's going to be issues that are going to happen, then yeah, you can move them away from each other and segregate them so you don't have issues with that. The prison the prison gangs, they're based on a lot of different stuff, okay? I mean, you might join the gang in the prison just for protection. It may be part of your race or ethnicity that I joined that gang. And, I mean, sometimes you're in a street gang and you move into the prison, they say, oh, wait, you're with this gang, you're part of us. And, at that point, you start getting with them. Now, this is where we look at what I just described of the STGs, which is security threat groups. Security threat groups are to prevent violence within the prison. So what they basically do is you'll have officers that are working this force, and they start seeing that three or more people are starting to conspire to do some violence in the prison, and you're getting intelligence on this. So this security threat group, you start getting intelligence, and you're like, okay, these people are going at it right now, and they're conspiring to do something bad. And once you get that intelligence, at that point, you got to kind of decompress that conspiracy from actually, going forth. So at that point, what you'll see is once they find out about it, these security threat groups, they'll take the people that they know, those 3 or more people that are starting to conspire to do something, and they'll put them either in solitary confinement. They'll say, hey, listen, this continues. Guess what? You're going to start losing your rights to see your family coming in here. But they're going to take away the prisoners' freedoms to do stuff. So you won't see people coming in and out of here anymore because of the fact that we don't trust you. Who's coming in right now? And are you trying to do a hit on the outside of the prison? Inside of the prison? So we start looking at a lot of different things, because if a threat happens outside the prison and one gang does a hit on another gang, that could come back to the prison and bring more violence. So there's a lot of things that happen. Just because somebody's locked up behind bars doesn't mean that they can't do stuff on the outside. So there's a lot of issues that you got to look at from the prison side with intelligence as well, because, I mean, inmates, they get smart, especially when they've been in there for a long time and they know the system, they know the guards, they just know how things flow, right? I shouldn't say guards anymore because they're correctional officers, but you know what I mean by that. So there's a lot of different things with that. So it's a structure, and, it could be, if you don't have that intelligence, you don't have people working those security threat groups, you could have some serious issues. There could be a threat to inmates or a huge riot that could occur in your correctional facility. So as far as things go with maintaining order, there were 6 categories of correctional officers that have been studied. And the main one that you look at are block officers, okay? So the block officer are supervisors of cell blocks that contain hundreds of inmates, right? So they're walking, making sure that everybody, they're monitoring cameras, making sure that all these cell blocks are well maintained. Then there's the work detail officers. Now the work detail officers, they'll supervise inmates doing different whatever work projects that they're doing, right? So if they're working in the store, if they're working in the library or something like that, you got, the detail with officers watching over those, as well as industrial shops, sorry, I can't talk, and school officers. If people are going to school or going to vocational education programs, at that point, you still got officers maintaining, while they're being taught, the safety of the inmates as well as the people who are teaching and educating them. Okay, the yard officers, this is where you usually get the younger people who have less seniority working in the yard, because the most dangerous spot. This is where a lot of stuff, maybe you might have a fight break out, you might have somebody shank somebody over in the yard, but it's the most violent area. So you'll see more of the younger officers and rookie officers getting that detail working out in the yards, just because of the fact that's the most dangerous area. Now, probably one of the safest areas is over there in the tower guards, because yeah, you're safe probably up in that tower, but the problem is you're by yourself and you're monitoring all what's going on in the yard. Might be a nice gig as you're getting close to retirement, but that's what the tower guards, they're posted high above the grounds facility, always watching what's going on. And then they can call out what they're seeing. I kind of look at that as kind of like, an offensive and defensive coordinator in football. So you're sitting up in the booth up there looking down at the field, letting the coach know what plays are going down. So that's what I look at the guard towers as. Then there's administrative assignments. So when we look at overseeing visitations, people coming into the prisons, what does that process look like? Where can people park their cars? Where can they come in? What kind of searches are being done of people that are coming in? How long can somebody stay on the phone with somebody? What letters are coming into the prison that we need to look at and review to make sure that it's safe and that everything in that package is safe that's being delivered. So the basically maintaining order, you have structure of your correctional officers maintaining different areas within the prison to deal with that span of control of a lot of issues. When you start talking about maintaining that order too, and teaching basically how to, when we talk about discipline, right? What is the point of discipline in the prison? One, to have orderly living, right? So people are in order, they're living their lives, they're not hurting each other in the prison, stuff like that. It's also to instill some kind of respect to authority, right? So they got to learn to respect authority figures in life, okay? Especially the correctional officers as well as administrators. However, it also teaches values of respectful behavior on an inmate's attitude when he or she is released from prison. So I often say it's not necessarily, yeah, it's to teach you to be nice to people here in prison, but when you get out of prison, I mean, think about the culture that we talk about. If somebody smiles at you and is nice to you, in prison you're like, should I punch them? But out here, they're like, oh, hi, and they're super friendly with you, right? Well, in prison, there's two different cultures. And if somebody's going to get reentry, you got to teach that respect. Okay, if somebody smiles at you and admire, don't punch them in the face because you might be back here, right? So it's just helping, getting that stuff done. Now, sanctions could come. So let's say an inmate, you're walking by and they don't want to do the work they're supposed to do. You're like, hey, man, you need to get to work. And they're like, no, man, F you, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm going to give you a verbal warning right now, but next time I'm going to give you a ticket. Then you're going to get some of your privileges taken away. So next time you want to go to see your family or see your kids or whatever, we're going to take that away from you because I'm going to write you that ticket right now for this, and it'll go before the disciplinary committee at that point. And you got to think about that. Inmates' rights, they're severely restricted because they don't have, an attorney at that point. They don't have the right to confront, their accusers or witnesses. It's a little bit different system within the prison. I had a guy on 28th Street one time. He was driving a vehicle and he had an open intox. And when I stopped him on 28th Street, he's actually on parole. So he had kid you not, he had a deuce right sitting right on his lap. When I stopped him, he didn't even hide it. And I walked up to him like, hey, step out of the vehicle, run him through sobrieties. He passed the sobrieties, but he still has open intox, and he's on parole, right? So he's violating parole. So at that point, I searched the vehicle. At the time, I could search the vehicle. Okay, the law, Arizona v. Gant hasn't come into play yet. But I searched the vehicle, and I find an ounce of cocaine in a shoe stuffed underneath one of the seats in the car. Well, it wasn't his car. And when I asked him, is everything in this vehicle yours? He said, oh, no, it's not mine. It's my buddy's car, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what's in here. So I couldn't pin the cocaine on him because there was no latent prints that came back to him on that cocaine. However, I did have to go to Jackson Prison and go to one of the his parole hearings with his parole officer. And that was very interesting walking inside Jackson Prison, dude. At that time, it was in full effect, and I mean, it was just depressing when I walked in there. And I remember sitting across from the gentleman who I arrested, and now he's back in prison, obviously, and describing what I saw, and, and just going through there, and they're like, well, was it his? I'm like, I don't know if it was his or not. That's why I didn't arrest him on it, because I seeked the warrant due to the fact that he said everything in that car wasn't his, you know what I mean? So said it was his friend's. But at that point, you go back and you look at that, and you look at the hearings, and he doesn't have an attorney right there and him on that parole hearing. In that disciplinary hearing that he had. So, he did get jammed up for the open intox, obviously. That was in his car. But it's just a different way of sanctioning prisoners, right? So they don't do something, right? Or they spit at some other inmate. You write him a ticket? Okay, cool. Guess what? You lose this privilege now because of that. And when you're in prison, you look forward to little things, that can be a big deal. And you don't want to lose those certain privileges, right? So when you're just looking at dealing with all those sanctions, we have to reflect on law enforcement. And we're like, well, what is use of force? What if they get in a fight? What if they say F you and aren't going anywhere? You know what I mean? And you're a correctional officer and you're like, hey, listen, you need to get out of your cell. And they're like, F you, I'm not getting out of my cell. All right, at what point can you use some kind of force, right? And basically the courts came down to that there's a malicious and sadistic standard. And if you violate somebody to the point where it's malicious and sadistic, okay, there's going to be a problem on your end. And the inmates can actually sue you too as a correctional officer. So when you talk about using too much force, Hudson v. McMillan was one of the court cases that dealt with this stuff, okay? And malicious and sadistically, I mean, you got to understand, if I'm doing something just to hurt you, okay, that's wrong, right? So pretty much, I always want to say this. If you do the right thing, you have nothing to worry about, right? But if you want to take something over the extreme and be a jerk as a correctional person to just flex your muscles or whatever it might be, and you do it physically stupidly, well, guess what? You're probably not going to be a correctional officer very long, and you're probably going to get sued. So think about that, and just use common sense with how much force you use. Make sure everything's reasonable, right? Females started coming to corrections in the 1970s, and there was a lot of lawsuits brought across saying that women can do the job, and they've proven themselves to be able to do the job in prisons. Quite frankly, I mean, it's nice to have females within female prisons too to work that, but it's also nice to have females working in the male prisons as well. Now you might say, gosh, well, what would it be like to be a female working in the prison? One of my friends who does work in the prison, she's like 5'2", maybe 110 pounds, right? Very small Hispanic woman, and she basically she still works for the prison. She's a supervisor in them now. And she's like, yeah, when I came into the prisons, I'd let them know I don't play. And, you come anywhere near me, you do anything to try to hurt me, it's not going to be good for you. And she's like, I'll call a bunch of people out, and she just makes sure that she's safe, because she's always making sure that there's somebody near or around or close by that, can come and aid her, right? But on top of that, she doesn't have any problems writing a ticket for somebody doing something stupid, because she's got to lay it down right away, because she knows that she ain't going to get taken advantage of, right? And she's got to let the prisoners know, the inmates know that she ain't going to get taken advantage of. And then they'll respect her. They'll be like, okay, she don't play. You don't want to mess with her. And they leave her alone. But she had to earn that, right? So, I mean, being a female in corrections, it can be difficult for a female in corrections, because they have to prove themselves, probably more than a male does. When we get into the 13th Amendment, and when we start talking about, like I said, dealing with a lot of different, I brought it up, you can't take somebody, the Supreme Court says, if they have medical conditions and you're not aiding their medical conditions, which we talked about earlier, you got to provide them the medical attention that they need, right? So, I mean, like there was a guy, I forgot what case it was complaining that of testicle pain, and he had testicle cancer, and they kept pushing it off. The medical doctor wasn't doing what he should have been doing, and of course, prison got sued because of that fact, because they weren't aiding the correct what do you call it? The aid that they need medically, okay? The medical aid that they need. So when we're talking, if you're diabetic, if you have depression that you're struggling with, psychotic episodes, all that stuff, I mean, yeah, you're restricted from a lot of things, but we still have to provide for you. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, when we start talking about even religious beliefs and dealing with certain food, I mean, if you eat kosher, well, can we give you ham and pig and shrimp? No. Right? It's like you have that religious freedom that we also got to look out for as well. So when we start talking about healthcare, we start talking about differences with people and, religions and stuff like that. We also have to have that respect, and we have to maintain that within the prisons. With women in prisons versus male, okay, the males tend to be more violent, where the women are not as violent. The males, it's like survival, right? And I say the rape that occurs, males will do it out of sexual frustration or power maybe, or just sexual relief, I should say. Where, violent too, maybe just to control somebody, right? Where women, it's more like unwanted touching, if anything. Sometimes, I mean, there hasn't been any real studies that showed statistically of like male guards or whatever, female officers, sexually assaulting the females in the prisons, or the males in prisons, vice versa, okay? But as far as we do know, there's a difference when the women are in prison. You have like the older ones who've been there longer kind of looking after the younger ones like mothers, okay? And they kind of like, hey, let me show how things roll here, right? Don't want to talk to that person. Look out for this over here. Don't do this because you might get hurt, right? So when we start looking at the way that the women are and male are, it's a little bit different. You do find more women dealing with lack of self-efficacy just because of the fact of where they come from. A lot of them said at some point they've been physically or sexually abused. And that's part of the reason why they have that lack of self-worth, and that's why they're there in those prisons. Being a mom is difficult, and I want you to think about this for a minute. There's not as many female prisons are there as male prisons. So like you could get stuck 300 to 500 miles, maybe even 800 miles away from your family. Well, now you're 500 miles away from your kids. Is it realistic for somebody to drive that distance to go see you in prison, where the males could have people like within, that same area or that same at least state as what they're in? So like looking at not as many prisons as we have for women compared to males, it makes it more difficult for women to have that relationship still with their kids and with their, even husbands or boyfriends or whatever it might be, because of the fact that they may be further out and further away from them. And that's just the way it is right now. As far as it deals with children, is it okay now for moms to be in prison without their children? Or should the children be in prison, especially infants or little toddlers, with their moms? At the end of this PowerPoint, there's actually a video that shows, moms with infants in prisons. And we ask you questions in journals. Do you agree with this? Do you think it's good or bad? And, people could take it both different ways. But, separating a mom from her child, especially at a young age, that's difficult. Now, it depends why the mom, got separated from her kid or why she's in prison, right? But let's say she just uses drugs too much. Should she have drug rehab at that point and maybe be supervised? Maybe be more of an apartment complex area, with her child, that's overseen by the correctional facility. I don't know, okay? I'm just saying, you can watch the video here dealing with mothers in prison, and it's pretty neat. But when you hear that term pseudo-family, that's what I'm not referring to as a mom and the real child. What we pseudo-family is the women there will start role-playing different parts, like this lady here has been in here for 20 years, and I just got in, and I look at her as my mom, right, in prison, because she looks after me. She's taking care of me and makes things go well with me here, that kind of stuff. And I think I pretty much covered everything with that. Dealing with inmates returning to society is difficult. And just think about this. So you've been in prison for 20 years and you come out. How has technology changed in 20 years? You're going to be like, you got a what? You got, that cell phone does that? You know what I mean? It's like, you kind of like way back off in technology. Technology changes so quickly in just like 4 years. So when you are in prison, and even laws and legislation change, right? So like you get out of prison and you're like, wait, I can't do that anymore? I got to do this now? I got to do that? A lot of that stuff, plays into a lot of different stuff. Now, there's different ways people get out. They get out through parole. So they get, brought out by the community. They have restrictions, so they can't drink alcohol. They can't commit a crime, otherwise they'll go back. They may have an expiration release. That means that the person served the whole sentence. So you get 20 years, you did 20 years without parole, you come out, now you don't have anybody looking over you. Why? Because you did your full 20 years. So you're not on parole, you're out. Why? Because you're expired, right? So that sentence you've done the whole time. When you start looking at pardon, governor or president may pardon you or overturn your conviction, and at that point, you get released from there too. Dealing with furlough, having basically a work release program, let's say, right, where maybe you may be able to go to work, but then you got to come back. So you go to work on a tether and you come back to the prison at night. And, obviously that's a lower level security prison that you may have that stuff. And, so some of those reasons, but return to society, it's hard, because you have different work release programs, halfway houses that you want to try to get people a job. But on top of that, when people say, are you a felon? Have you been arrested? And you say yes, and explain. And you just basically said, I did this and now I'm out on parole, or, I just got out of prison. It's like, how many employers are going to be like, oh yeah, I'm excited to have you on board? Not many. So now it's hard for a person when they come back out to find a job. And then at that point, they're like, I don't understand the technology, I don't understand this or that, and now I've just got to survive now. So I'm back in survival mode, right? I feel more comfortable actually in the institution that I was just in, rather now here in the real world where I have all this freedom, but now I'm forgetting to eat my breakfast and lunch because of the fact I'm not getting called to breakfast and lunch. And, you know, it's like just there's a lot of things that a person at this point that's been in prison for so long, depending on how long they were in there for, and now they come out, it can be very difficult for some people to have that transition, especially if, like I said, somebody smiles at you the wrong way, and now you go off on them because you're like, back in prison, if they did that, you know, they're up to something. So there's a lot of different things that you got to think about dealing with putting people back into society and trying to get them back into it. Other than that, if you have any questions, feel free to email me with any questions. And at the end, just watch that link. It deals with moms in prisons with their children. It's a pretty interesting link, and just, you know, maybe have a thought process. What's the benefits of it? Okay, could the children suffer from this kind of environment? You know, and would this program work if you had male offenders, right, dads in prison? So kind of think about those things, and everybody have a good week, and we'll see you later.